Brittany Broski, commonly known as Bree, sat in her office, gazing through the window where the first rays of morning light pierced through the white clouds. The scene was serene, but inside her, there was nothing but a deep sense of emptiness. She had spent her entire career building and creating groundbreaking advertising strategies, all with one goal in mind: to prove her worth. Bree was not someone who could be easily satisfied with small successes. She always wanted more. The company she worked for was one of the giants in the media industry, a place where everyone expected creative strategies and market leadership. Everything had started off smoothly for her. When she joined this company a few years ago, Bree realized this would be the place where she could truly prove herself. A person of persistence, always eager to learn, she carved out her own reputation in the media field. She wasn't the brightest star in the company, but she was always behind successful campaigns, always the one making a difference. Everyone knew her as a calm, dedicated person who always put the collective good above everything else. Late nights of work, early mornings, and tense meetings were all things she accepted because she believed that in the end, her hard work would be rewarded. One of the biggest projects of the year, an advertising campaign for a newly launched product by a famous brand, gave Bree a major opportunity to assert herself. She and her team had spent months preparing every small detail, from the creative strategy to how the message would be delivered to customers. Everything was meticulously planned, perfect. Bree presented bold strategies that surprised the team with her vision. This project would serve as a solid stepping stone for her to advance within the company. As long as everything went according to plan, but things did not go as expected. The feeling came unexpectedly. She saw her name on the list of people working on the campaign, but then another name appeared: Mark. Mark was the company's new creative director, someone who had just joined the team. She had heard a lot about him, that he was a genius in the industry, and everyone expected him to bring breakthroughs. Bree wasn't worried, thinking that if the company gave Mark the creative lead, he would just take over the parts she had already developed. But when the campaign was launched, Bree was shocked to realize that all the ideas she had poured countless late nights into, all the strategies she had carefully prepared, were now shattered. Mark, in his role as creative director, had changed everything, making adjustments she disagreed with. And in the end, the campaign was launched under his name, with no credit given to Bree. She couldn't forget the feeling when she saw the campaign launched and praised by clients and partners. But not one person mentioned her. No one knew that those strategies were the result of her tireless work. The feeling of having her efforts stolen, being dismissed outright, made Bree feel discarded. She couldn't believe her eyes when she saw Mark proudly presenting the campaign she had worked so hard on, without ever mentioning her, without acknowledging her contribution. That feeling was hard to describe. Bree sat in the meeting room, surrounded by the bright eyes of her colleagues, but she felt like she was invisible. Everyone looked at her, but no one saw her. She stood up, tried to smile, and participated in the discussions, but inside, she felt like a failure, of no value in the eyes of those around her. As time passed, that feeling grew stronger. Bree began to realize that everything in the company revolved around Mark. The important meetings, the big decisions, were all made by him, and all the efforts she had made, all the contributions she had given, were ignored. She began to feel that she no longer belonged there, no longer had any value in the eyes of the company and the people around her. She knew that she had been silently and ruthlessly pushed out of the game. The most painful thing wasn't being overlooked in the big campaigns, but the betrayal from the very person she had considered a friend, Mark. She had once shared with him the struggles of her work, the strategies she dreamed of executing. She had trusted him, but he had used her ideas to advance, to make a name for himself, without any regard for Bree's efforts. Bree didn't know how to face this truth. She felt like a loser in her own story. The day Bree received the news of her transfer to another department, she felt as though the world was collapsing beneath her feet. The company she had been loyal to for so many years, where she had poured her heart into building her career, now cast her aside without mercy. No explanation, no comfort. It was just a cold notification via email. She had hoped she would continue, that she would keep proving her worth, but now everything was over. That night, when Bree sat in her apartment, silently staring out the window, she no longer saw the bright rays of hope. The feeling of emptiness took over her mind. She couldn't understand why things had turned out this way. Why had all her efforts, all the late nights, the projects full of passion, ended in an unexplainable shock? Why had she been betrayed by those she trusted? The unanswered questions made Bree feel more and more like she had lost faith in everything herself, the things she had built. But there was one thing Bree didn't know, and this would change her life completely. She wasn't the loser. This was just the beginning of a comeback she never even imagined. Bree couldn't remember exactly when it was, but there came a moment when she realized that her life couldn't continue to sink into silence and despair. The loss, the betrayal from Mark, and the push-out from the company had made her feel discarded, like she no longer had any value. But slowly, in those late nights, when everything around her was bathed in darkness and silence, a different feeling began to form within her. It wasn't sadness or regret. It was something like a small flame starting to burn in her heart. She didn't want to give up. She wanted to stand up, even if it meant starting over from scratch. Each morning, when Bree woke up, she no longer looked at herself in the mirror with the weariness of a loser. She told herself that she would not let this failure define her life. Instead of drowning in the feeling of betrayal, she decided to listen to herself and figure out why she felt abandoned. It wasn't just because of the company, nor just because of Mark. It was because she had relied too much on what others thought of her. She had allowed herself to depend too much on external recognition instead of realizing her true worth. But now, everything would be different. Bree understood that if she wanted to change her life, she had to stand up on her own, not wait for help or change from anyone else. So, in the days that followed, she began working quietly. No more bustling meetings, no more heated discussions in the office. Bree, in the quiet, started planning for a major turning point in her life. She began to relearn marketing, personal branding, and creative strategies that no one could steal. She realized that she needed to rebuild herself from the ground up, doing everything with her own hands, without relying on anyone. She enrolled in online courses, attended small workshops about communication strategies and marketing. She spent hours researching successful projects she had once dreamed of executing, but never had the chance. As time passed, Bree began to notice a significant change in herself. She was no longer the shy girl, always afraid of being unrecognized. Every day, when sitting in front of her computer, Bree felt she was getting closer to her goal. She began to rebuild her reputation, not from her old company, but from the small projects she created on her own. Her personal projects, her creative writings about marketing and communication that she shared on social media, started to attract attention from influencers in the industry, though still small. Each sign was a reminder that Bree was on the right track. It was also during this time that a chance meeting occurred. A former colleague from her old company reached out to her, offering a collaboration on a project. He wasn't the one who had betrayed her, but he was one of the people who had witnessed the changes in the company. He said, "Bree, I've seen your work online, and it's really impressive. Could you help me with a marketing campaign for the company I'm working for?" This question caught her off guard, not because of the offer, but because it brought back memories of the old company, of both the good and painful moments. However, Bree understood that this was an opportunity to prove herself, not just to this friend, but to herself. She agreed and began working on that small project, but during the process, she realized something important. This wasn't just an opportunity to showcase her capabilities again. It was also a chance to fully shed the shadow of her old company, of Mark. She worked hard, not just to prove herself to others, but to make herself proud. The old company, the people who had betrayed her, were no longer her concern. The compliments from those around her, from clients, and from new colleagues, made her realize that she truly had value. She didn't need her old company or Mark to build her career. Bree had quietly started building a client base for herself. She no longer wanted to associate with those who had betrayed her. Gradually, she built a network of strong relationships with people who genuinely valued her skills and creativity. Each project, no matter how small, made her feel like she was regaining her confidence. But not everything was smooth sailing. As Bree made progress, the challenges grew bigger. One day, while working, she received an email from a former client, someone who had been an important partner of the old company. In the email, the client asked her to redo the campaign she had helped the old company develop. This made Bree feel unsettled, as it reminded her of the betrayal by Mark. But a part of her knew that this was an opportunity to prove that she could do better, without relying on anyone else, day by day. Bree learned how to face difficulties. She didn't let the pain, the hurt from the past, affect what she was building. Each time she faced a challenge, she reminded herself that she wasn't a loser. She had survived the biggest storms of her life, and now was the time for her to shine once again. However, change didn't come quickly. Every day, Bree had to battle with feelings of anxiety, with doubts about her own abilities. But deep inside her, something had changed. It was a determination to never give up. She believed that, in the end, her hard work would bring the results she deserved. Bree gradually realized that every new step in her entrepreneurial journey came with harsh challenges. She was no longer the naive girl, easily deceived and overlooked. That painful lesson from the past had, however, made her stronger than ever. She began working with major clients, renowned brands in the industry, and slowly built a solid reputation. Every campaign she launched, whether big or small, exceeded expectations. Bree was no longer just a silent worker. She had become a leader, someone who created real change. But as things began to improve, unexpected situations arose. She received an email from a large marketing company inviting her to join a collaborative project. It was an opportunity she couldn't pass up, and Bree felt that this was her moment to rise and prove to everyone that she was not a failure. However, as she reviewed the project details, one name stood out: Mark, the former colleague from the company who had once betrayed her and taken credit for her work on the previous advertising campaign. What she didn't expect was that Mark was now the leader of this project, and he wanted to work with her on a large-scale campaign for an international brand. This news made Bree feel as if the world had turned upside down. She didn't know what to do, but the feeling of being dragged back into this game once again made it impossible for her to sit still. Her rational mind told her to decline, but a part of her saw this as an opportunity that couldn't be ignored. She couldn't continue living in the shadow of past decisions. This was the time to confront what had happened, to prove that her success didn't need anyone else, despite the unease lingering in her heart. Bree decided to participate. However, she didn't act as she had before, sitting back and waiting for opportunities. This time, she quietly began to rebuild her own strategy. She started researching the project, learning everything she could about the client, and crafting a meticulous plan that no one could predict. She didn't want to let Mark or anyone else take advantage of her again. She realized that this was the time to not only succeed in her work, but to triumph over herself. The official collaboration project began, and Bree and her team worked tirelessly. She continuously updated and refined strategies to ensure everything was flawless. However, the small changes Bree made began to irritate Mark. The sense of control he once had was no longer his, and this shift was something he could not tolerate. In the following meetings, Bree could clearly see Mark becoming more tense and awkward when forced to deal with decisions she was making. She understood that. Despite his desire to maintain control over the project, she had regained the power she had once held. Then, an unexpected turn of events occurred. During a crucial strategic meeting with the client, Mark, the project leader, was undermined by the very ideas Bree had quietly built. People began to realize that her strategies were delivering outstanding results, while Mark's proposals failed to show the innovation the company had been hoping for. In fact, Bree's old company started to feel the difference in her work. Her former clients, who had worked with her before, began to return, recognizing that she was the one who truly understood them, and that she had created real successful campaigns, not just empty words. Mark, who once thought he could use Bree as a pawn in his game, was now starting to feel the repercussions. Slowly, people began to realize that his strategies weren't effective, and attention shifted to Bree, although Mark tried to maintain his image in the project. His failure to apply old strategies caused him to lose trust from both clients and colleagues. His arrogance and self-importance no longer had a place in this game. No one wanted to hear his empty theories anymore. Instead, they focused on the practical solutions Bree brought. This not only impacted Mark, but it also affected her old company. The people who had once seen Bree as an indispensable part of successful campaigns now began to realize the huge mistake they made by letting her go. The project Bree was working on for the competitor began to exceed the goals her old company had set. Soon after, an unexpected call came to Bree from the director of her old company. They wanted her back, but not in her previous role. They had a larger offer for her, a position she had always hoped for. The feeling of victory began to spread within her. Bree no longer needed to fight to prove herself. Her work, her success, had already answered everything. She had overcome Mark, overcome herself, and regained what she had lost. Bree sat at her desk, the faint light of the afternoon streaming through the window. She looked at the computer screen, where notifications and emails awaited. It had been a long time since she felt any pressure from her old company, from Mark, or from those who had once hurt her. The success from the projects she had led not only helped her rebuild her career, but also restored her faith in herself. The feeling of freedom, no longer bound by rules, pressures, or control, made her feel relieved. But then, the phone call from her old boss changed everything. She hadn't expected them to call, inviting her back. The director of the company didn't just want her to return to her old role, but made her an enticing offer, a higher position with authority and important projects that she had never been involved in before. The sweet words couldn't hide the fact that the company was struggling. They hadn't just lost a brilliant strategist, but also a crucial part of their development. The feeling now wasn't anger or betrayal anymore, but a sense of clarity, and understanding that this was the moment for her to truly prove her worth. She wouldn't let past hurts influence her decisions today. Despite having gone through so many difficult emotions, deep down, Bree felt ready, not to return as someone weak, but to stand strong and do things she had never done before. When her old boss spoke about lofty goals, about regaining market leadership, Bree simply smiled. It wasn't a hasty decision, it was a calculated move. She wouldn't return just to serve the ambitions of others. She would return to lead, to bring the real changes the company needed. Bree realized that she no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. She only needed to prove it to herself. The road ahead was filled with challenges, but Bree knew that if she wanted to return and start fresh, she needed to rely on her own abilities and strategies. This wasn't just about winning. It was about taking control of the game. She had realized that strategy wasn't only about creativity, but also about managing relationships, resources, and building strong connections. This was something she had overlooked before. In her old company, a leader not only had to be creative, but also knew how to connect and create valuable links. But before making the final decision, Bree knew she had to complete one important task. She needed to clear away everything old and no longer useful in her life. She opened up old files, emails, and documents she hadn't touched in a while, including those from the campaigns Mark had stolen credit for. She didn't do this to seek revenge, but to make sure that what she did this time would be a strong step forward. Unburdened by the past, Bree didn't need to look back with anger or hatred. She only needed to look ahead with clarity and confidence. Bree knew that this was the moment to take control of her life again. She wasn't returning to her old company because of the sweet words in the invitation. She was returning because she understood that she could change everything. Her return wasn't a surrender. It was a remarkable comeback that she would own. It wasn't about starting over from scratch, but about standing up and asserting her place once again, with the firmness, confidence, and strategies she had learned from the painful years. At the same time, Bree's rise was no longer confined to small projects. She began receiving collaboration offers from large companies, receiving praise from industry insiders. Her articles and strategies were being praised by many in the media industry. Her projects didn't just succeed financially, but they also made a real impact, changing the way traditional marketing campaigns were implemented. Bree was no longer just a strategist. She had become a symbol of change, of what could be achieved when one refused to give up, when one learned to rise after failure, when the director of her old company called again, this time to arrange a face-to-face meeting. Bree no longer felt uncertain or confused. She knew exactly what she wanted. This meeting wasn't to seek approval from them. It was to assert that she didn't need to return to prove her worth. She could do that from the foundation she had rebuilt with her own hands. No one saved her, only she could save herself. And now, Bree was ready to face any challenge that came her way. When Bree walked into the meeting room of her old company, the light from the tall windows streamed in, creating a vast and imposing space. The air in the room seemed to stand still, as if everything around her was waiting for a change, for a decision that would shape the future. But Bree no longer felt anxious or restless like she had before. She was no longer the girl who could easily be overlooked or forgotten. She didn't come here to apologize or explain herself anymore. She had come to assert herself. She sat down, looking around at the people in the room, from the director to the former colleagues who had once been part of her life. They were still familiar faces. But now Bree realized they were no longer the ones who could bring her down. Instead, they were the ones standing in front of the change she had brought. The company director, the one who had called her back, looked at her with expectation, but Bree didn't rush to respond. She sat in silence for a moment, meeting the eyes of those around her. Those eyes no longer held judgment or doubt. Instead, there was curiosity, anticipation. She knew this wasn't the time for flowery words. Everything she needed to prove was now in the results, not in speeches. Bree had quietly rebuilt her own company. Throughout the time, she had not only worked on creative projects, but also developed an emotional marketing model, a method that had been overlooked in her old company, which always chased dry metrics and traditional strategies. The campaigns she had implemented hadn't just been successful, they had created real change in how people viewed brands. She didn't just create good strategies, she created emotions, lasting connections with customers. That was the power Bree brought. The director of her old company looked at the computer screen, where data and reports were displayed. "Your campaigns are truly impressive, Bree," he said. But his gaze no longer held self-satisfaction. Instead, there was a hint of surprise, even a little worry. The numbers didn't lie. Bree's success was undeniable. He had called her back not for a good reason, but because the company was in crisis, and they needed someone who could change the situation. But now, he realized that what Bree had done wasn't just filling a gap, it was a real revolution in the way business was done. Mark, the one who had betrayed Bree and taken credit for her work, could no longer maintain his position. The confidence and the shadow of control he once had were gone. As the company began to reassess Bree's strategies, Mark had become obsolete. What he had done now wasn't enough to sustain success. People began to look at Bree with admiration, awe. Her ideas, the strategies she had rolled out, were delivering tangible results. But for Mark, what he had contributed was now just a collection of vague plans, lacking in practicality. Slowly, he lost the trust of everyone in the company, just as Bree had known. It wasn't through direct confrontation, but through results, that she had proven her worth. In fact, Bree didn't feel satisfied with Mark's downfall. She didn't feel victorious through others paying the price. She had been betrayed before, and she understood that retribution wasn't something everyone desired. What Bree truly sought was recognition, being seen for who she truly was, not by putting someone else down, but by what she had achieved through her own abilities. She knew that, no matter what happened to Mark, he was ultimately responsible for his own actions. Bree realized that not every battle had to end with a direct confrontation. Sometimes, silence and quiet change brought the greatest results. She had rebuilt everything from the smallest details, from persistence, from the strategies she had researched and improved each day. The results she had achieved not only helped her rebuild her reputation, but also made her old company reconsider how they had treated her. In that final meeting, Bree didn't need to throw out challenges or calls for attention. She just needed to look into their eyes and feel the change. She didn't need to say that she had won or that she had been vindicated. She simply smiled and said to the director, "I don't need to come back here to prove anything. I've done that through the work and results I've delivered, and that was enough." When Bree left the meeting room, she didn't look back, not because of anger or hatred, but because she knew that what she had done would speak for itself. She didn't need to depend on anyone to feel her own worth, and no matter what decision the company made, she had won through herself. It wasn't about revenge. It was about growth and true victory.